So tonight we're here to talk about this wonderful book called Sex Beyond Yes, Pleasure and Agency for Everyone. And as you can imagine, or maybe not, I have a lot of questions for Quill, and I could probably talk about their book for approximately 6 hours straight, but I'm not going to do this tonight. My goal is that to make you want to read this book, and maybe to give Quill a chance to talk about their project and their hopes with this book. So, Quill, thank you for writing this book, first of all. And maybe I thought that you could start with telling us a bit about why you wrote this specific book. So, first of all, you've written an enormous amount of books, an enormous amount of papers. You've written a lot about these specific questions of sexual agency and consent and so on and so forth. But why did you decide to turn it into a book, and especially a book aimed at a general audience?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to everybody on here. It is really fun seeing the wide range of people from all over the world who have signed in. It's a real thrill. And I'm also just very grateful to you, Manon, for doing this because obviously you're the ideal interlocutor for this conversation. But yeah, to answer your question, let me say a few things about why I wrote it. One is I had read a lot about sex, including a lot about sex from philosophers' points of view and from feminist points of view. And I was really struck by the extent to which stuff about sex, regardless of its political orientation, tended to focus on bad sex and how sex could go wrong and the various ways in which sex could go astray. A lot of the feminist work is about how sex is set against a background of patriarchy, which messes it up and makes it very easy for it to be terrible. And I learned a lot from that literature, and it's, of course, an extremely important literature, but I felt like there was just a real lacuna when it came to talking about what makes sex good and how do we have good sex and how do we fill in that story about sex being good. So my first goal was to write a book about good sex. I also, the title Sex Beyond Yes was very significant for me because on the one hand, I think it's very clear that saying yes to sex is at best a mere minimum bar for it being ethically acceptable. I actually argue in the book that we don't even always necessarily like literally say yes to sex, but saying yes to sex can't be more than a minimum bar. So I really wanted to know quite literally what comes beyond yes, what happens after yes. It seemed like we were having very few conversations about the follow-up to a yes. Once sex has been initiated, assuming that was initiated with consent and everybody wants to do it, then what? How do we make it good? A different point about why I wanted to write the book is about the second half of the title, Pleasure and Agency for Everyone. It seemed to me that even books that were really good about acknowledging that not everyone is heterosexual, that not everyone is cis, that there are lots of different kinds of bodies and sexual orientations out there, still the sort of patriarchy infused traditional heterosexual sexual encounter was the one that really defined the imagination around which these books were being written. Often critically, which is great, but it still defined the imagination. And I was very intent on writing a book that literally and insistently centered everyone's pleasure and agency, that took seriously the kind of good sex that people can have with different kinds of bodies, different kinds of capacities, of different ages, of different gender identities, of different sexual orientations, in different kinds of relationships and different configurations. I wanted all of that stuff to not merely be acknowledged, but to push it to the center of our imagination. And I guess the final point following on that is I'm a philosopher. I've written a lot of philosophy books, a lot of philosophy articles. I pride myself as a philosopher on writing in a sort of clear and accessible way. But there really is a big difference between the way philosophers write scholarly works about sex, which can be quite abstract and bloodless, although your book is an exception, Manon, and I love it for that. And actually engaging with the messiness of sex. And I'm also trained as an ethnographer. And I've spent a lot of time in alternative sex communities, and I have a lot of friends who are sex workers, and I go to a lot of kink events and so on. And I really wanted a book that was infused with ethnography and not just philosophy. I wanted a book that brought in all of these anecdotes and all of these perspectives and voices and all of this messiness and really sort of gave life to the argument rather than staying at the level of philosophical argument. And that was something that I had not seen from a philosopher before. So those were really my primary. Oh, and I also wanted it to be short and for people to be able to read it fast, which apparently I succeeded at. People have told me that it only takes a couple of hours to read, which I'm delighted by.
Well, it took me much more than a couple of hours to read because but yeah, I can see how you can read it fast, but a couple of hours, people are really fast readers.
Yeah, I guess.
But yeah, okay, so I have three follow-up questions to each of your axes, but maybe just to follow up on your last point about what it is to like, what does it mean about philosophy the way you wrote this book? So I really liked, so there's this moment where you say, I have become increasingly impatient with the abstract, disengaged ways in which academics typically discuss bodies, freedom, consent, and pleasure. And it's very clear that there's a style question going on. But would you say that it's a philosophy book? Because you seem to be saying, in a way, like, I'm pushing the philosophy away. But isn't it just that you're doing philosophy in a different way? Is it still philosophy? So I'm very interested in hearing what you have to say about this.
I mean, part of me wants to resist the question because I don't want to gatekeep what counts as philosophy, but part of me also thoroughly understands your question. Um, Look, I don't think I'm capable of writing not as a philosopher. I don't know if it's a philosophy book. Like, I don't know what the necessary and sufficient conditions for that would be. But I do know that for my whole life, I've been trained as and working as a philosopher, and it infuses everything about how I see the world and how I talk. And so there's a sense in which, yes, despite all of it, it reads as a philosophy book because I care about making conceptual distinctions and being precise with language and thinking about what the broader meaning of a phenomenon is and how to fit it into a larger framework. So I think all of those standard sort of philosophical ways of approaching the world are still there in the book. And I hope that for non-philosophers, well, I'll say both. I hope that philosophers who read it still feel like they're getting philosophical arguments out of it. And I also hope that non-philosophers who read it will feel like they have like a genuine grabbable access point to the kinds of things that philosophers care about and that matter to philosophers. But I mean, my sort of grandiose hope is that more people start doing philosophy in ways that are really, and not just in a token sense, grounded in and infused by ethnography and anecdote and real life. I want philosophy to be responding to messy real world experience and not just to other philosophers. And I think there is more and more of that work starting to emerge, and I hope that this is part of it. So I guess the short answer is I'm coming down on it is a philosophy book, but it's a philosophy book that hopefully does a lot more and that one doesn't need to be a philosopher in order to understand what it's doing. At least that's my hope.
And what about people? I mean, this is obviously a response that I had also to my book, but who would say, well, isn't it a bit cringe that philosophers think they have something to tell us about what good sex is? Like, like the image of the philosopher, except for some images of the French philosopher who's like so hot, etc. Like, we're not exactly seen as the people who know what's up. I mean, you might be an exception, but in general, so like, why do we why do we think that philosophy has something to say specifically about what happens beyond yes? Because I
Yeah.
also, like, in my work, as very similar to yours, I in that regard, like, I talk about consent as a sort of um entrance ticket or QR code, and then we have the feeling that then there's nothing left to say. But it's a bit
Exactly.
like in love, there's nothing left to say after they fall in love, and then, like, that's the end of the movie, right? And I feel like there's a similar thing here of saying, is there something to say, and why would philosophy be well positioned to respond to this?
Okay, yeah, I feel like that's actually two quite different
Yeah.
questions, and I'll try to answer both of them. Um, I do find a lot of philosophy of sex really cringe. I think a lot of it is really cringe. I don't think that there's anything about being a philosopher per se that makes somebody especially equipped to talk about this topic. Um, the way I do philosophy, and this has always been true throughout my career, is, and it's really just a matter of my attentional structure. I don't really know how to do philosophy any other way than this. Is I always end up doing philosophy about the topic, the things that are in my actual life that I'm experiencing that make me curious and engaged and critically aware. So my philosophical work is just always responsive to my actual experience. When I was pregnant over 20 years ago, I got fascinated by how weird it was to be pregnant in our culture and how weird it was to have a young baby in our culture. And I ended up writing a book about pregnancy and motherhood that was grounded in that experience. My book before this one was on city living, and that grew out of a lifetime of being passionate about exploring cities and about the sort of what makes urban spaces work and not work, and like from direct experience. In the case of this book, I've been upfront about the fact that I have spent a whole lot of time at sex festivals, kink conferences, organizations where I'm spending a lot of time working closely with sex workers, queer spaces, sex nightclubs, and so on. That doesn't make me immune from being cringe, but I really do think that it is important, if you are going to talk about a human phenomenon as rich and complicated as sex, as a philosopher, that yeah, your expertise at drawing distinctions carefully and using language well come from philosophy, but your expertise about the actual texture of the ethics and sociality of sex needs to come from actual experience. And I try to make that clear in the book, that this is grounded not just in my own experiences, but in my really trying to take seriously the ethnography of other people's experiences who I'm drawing on. The other question, why should there be anything to say after yes? It's a super interesting question, and it's one that I haven't gotten before. Um, there's a lot of different ways I could answer it, but I think I'm going to stick to this one. Um, I'm often fascinated in my work, whether or not I'm talking about sex, with the fact that we have this tendency to reduce narratives that happen in time and space and that are extended to these sort of moments that we're supposed to use to measure and understand the entire thing. Um, and when I teach this to my students, the example that I give to try to make this clear quickly is, if you hear just one note, it's not yet determinate what note that song is part of or that piece is part of, right? It literally only becomes what it is when there are more notes. Sex, like so many things, is like that, right? Sex is something that we build up to, hopefully, we build up to, and then it starts. And as it starts, it's a complicated event that we, adjust and collaborate how it goes. And then one way or another, we wind down from it, it ends, and then we exit, and then we're still to some extent socially embroiled with the person we had sex with, and we part. And that's a whole narrative. so much of our social conversation and our philosophical conversation has focused on this one specific moment, which, as you nicely point out in your book, typically doesn't even happen, which is like this moment of official initiation where somebody is like, shall we have sex? Yes. Right? We rarely get a neat moment of initiation like that. But even when we do, that moment is just one moment in this whole temporally extended thing. And I want to claim that what significance it has or doesn't have, or whether it's part of good sex or bad sex, just can't be determined by looking at whether it was a good quality yes or a bad quality yes or whatever. It has to be situated in the whole story. So, of course, there's stuff to say about what happens after, because that moment of initiation is just one moment in something that's inherently temporal. And when sex goes well, we are throughout the sexual encounter, either verbally or non-verbally or both, communicating with one another, adjusting to each other, responding to each other's bodies, trying to create an event that is pleasurable. And then we're figuring out together, how does it end? Does it need to end? Like, is an exit called for? Or, but even if everything's going well, how do we bring this to a close? And how do we treat each other afterwards? People don't talk hardly ever about aftercare, but it matters to the meaning of the sexual event and to whether it was good or bad or pleasurable or unpleasurable, how we interact with each other when it's done. So I just feel like there's tons to be said. And that tendency to focus on the moment of consent is sort of like very typical philosophical or liberal discourse, where we try to find a single moment that we can measure the whole thing with, and it just doesn't work.
Yeah, so I like what you say, and I find it interesting that you put it in temporal terms because I was very struck in this book by how much of a geographer book it is,
Yeah.
that it's really a spatial book.
Yes.
And not just a temporal book. Especially, I found it very interesting how you talk about the social ecology of this scaffolding of agency, and that there's something very environmental in the
Yes.
way you think about sex, which I found very new compared to my like radical feminist framework of power and politics and yeah and domination. But sometimes I found you a little bit too optimistic because of your geographer perspective. But most most importantly, my worry about this is that precisely when you talk about social ecology and community, etc., is to what extent what we say about sex is valid outside of a very specific moment, culture, place. So I'm asking this. I mean, you also live between two countries, but I lived between three now, and it seems to me very clear that on the one hand, I'm trying in my work and you're trying in your work to have something to say about what good sex is that would be valid for British people, Germans, French people, Americans. But at the same time, like how widely different the social ecologies are and
Yeah.
how widely so can we really like talk beyond our community about sex or yeah cultural norms.
Yeah. That's a wonderful question. I think, um, to answer it, I would like to back up and just say 1 minute about what you mean, because you're exactly right about my having this like real geography and spatial flavor to the book. Um, so a big theme of the book is this idea of scaffolding. And very briefly, the idea is that good, strong sexual agency is not the kind of thing that we have or don't have on our own, or even in relationship to a partner. It's not just about being like a good, free, strong, autonomous chooser. That good sexual agency is scaffolded, which is to say that there are all of these layers, including our physical environment, our social environment, our economic situation, our legal environment, our educational environment. All of these social layers do a better or worse job of providing us with the support and resources that can hold our agency in place, right? That none of us are perfectly autonomous. The world is always imperfect and sub-ideal. We're always pushed around by forces and power that we can't control. So none of us are perfect choosers. But the reason we can have good agency is because when things go well, we can be supported in all of these different ways by our surroundings. And that for me very much includes, as you point out, sort of my geographer's obsession with the literal physical surroundings. Like, can you leave easily if you need to? Is there safety equipment on hand? Is there somebody who will hear you if you need to? That kind of thing. I agree with you that it's extremely culturally specific what the scaffolding looks like. And I think that's true both descriptively and normatively, which is to say different cultural contexts provide different scaffolding, but also different cultural norms call for different scaffolding. Actually, the first event that I did on this book was a book launch in Amsterdam. And my discussant, Marie McCullough, is Finnish. And I have a whole chapter about sex talk and how to have good quality sex talk and how to like talk well with your partner in order to make sex good. And her comment was basically like, I'm Finnish. We don't talk. We hate talk. What do you have to say to me? We never want to talk to each other. So there are different cultural norms, and what feels like sexy and supportive in one environment isn't going to in another. And I don't think that in the book I'm trying to give like sort of universal normative prescriptions for what scaffolding should look like. But I do think there are some things that, even though they're going to take on different cultural shapes and textures, are pretty universal. So, for example, I think having a well-informed, non-shaming community of friends who we can use for hermeneutic resources to like talk about what's sexually possible, who we can use to think through what might be ethically problematic or not, like is this relationship I'm in really healthy or isn't it, and who we can go to if we're in trouble and who won't shame us. That I think like the specifics are going to be culturally universal, but the role that like strong, solid communities of support and friend groups play that are free of shaming, that I think is universal. It's not universal that it exists, but it's universal that it's important. Or to just give one more example, and then I'll stop.
Can I just
Yeah,
follow up on this very quickly, because
yeah,
maybe that points to some place where I worry you're too lucky. Is that I feel like you're basically writing this book from a place of you're you're a sexpert philosophically, and you're a sexpert in practice. Like that, you really you have thought about this a lot. So that puts you in a position of being able to talk about it. But you're also part of communities that have norms that are extremely high
yeah, right.
of how we talk about this, how we think about this, how we. And so, on the one hand, I feel like it allows you to say things that I subscribe to 100%. Like, we should all use safe words. Like, safe words are good for a lot of things in life and for everyone in sex. The most vanilla people should also use safe words. But at the same time, I kind of worry about, and that's a worry I have about my own work of, is the standard, isn't there such a gap between the standard you're proposing and the actual life of people that it, like, I mean, as you know, I went to the trial of what happened to Giselle Pellicot, and the whole time I was there, I was like, I'm thinking about sex as conversation. How exactly can we mix up the individual and the structural, and what is a social movement? And these guys, they just rape a half dead woman and they don't care. Like, what are
Right.
we even? Is this gap even bridgeable? Like,
Yeah. I mean, that's a depressing but fair question. I mean, one of the things that I'm trying to do in the book that's actually super important to me is I'm trying to say, so I'll come directly back to what you said, but one of the things I'm trying to say is, look, this isn't all or nothing. We all have imperfect agency and imperfect autonomy. And I also argue, and you argue this too, this is something we have in common, that none of us can ever simply just like extract ourselves from background power norms and power inequalities. None of us, not even, I agree with you. I think, I'm quite on a far end of privilege with respect to these things, but none of us can extract ourselves with these things. So we're always beginning from a position of imperfection. And also, none of these scaffolds on their own are either necessary or sufficient. Nobody has all the scaffolds. So, what we're always trying to do, or should be always trying to do, is from this like fact of human vulnerability and imperfection, and from the fact of an imperfect society, finding what scaffolds we can. And we're not going to get all of them, right? So, yeah, you're absolutely right. Touche. When I go talk to my friends about some complicated sexual issue, we're like, a bunch of PhDs with tons of sex experience who are feminists operating at this super high level. It's not your standard conversation, but that doesn't make it not important for somebody to have a much simpler but still important friend group who they can bounce things off of, right? And one of the things I do in the book, I don't know if you remember this part, is, but I give 3 examples of a young gay man who's trying to have his first encounter with another gay man. And I tell the same story 3 times where their internal desires are identical and their internal capacities are identical, but the scaffolding they have around them is very different. And so in one case, the scaffolding is disastrously bad. And in one case, it's kind of medium. And in one case, it's fantastic. And I try to show that the sexual agency in the 3 cases is really different. But I think what really matters about your question is that medium level. Like, yes, people can have good, pleasurable, ethically acceptable sex, even if a lot of the scaffolds are missing and things are messed up. But there have to be some scaffolds. It can't just be leaving people to the social scripts as we find them. Like, another one that I was going to mention is financial scaffolding. Something I think about a lot is if you are 100% financially dependent on a partner and have no financial resources to go anywhere else, I think that no matter how like nice that partner is to you, your sexual agency with them is close to zero, right? Because you cannot possibly risk being disenfranchised by them. Like, even if they're not going to be terrible to you, you can't even risk them just deciding that they don't want you as their sexual partner anymore because you need them for your financial survival. So, like, financial scaffolding is another example of important scaffolding. So, I think you're really right. Like, very, very few people have all of the tools and the community and the luck to have like these beautiful, perfect, scaffolded agential encounters, but there's still really a continuum. And one of the layers that I think we can work on a lot to make things a lot better for a lot of people is just like dramatically better sex education, starting way earlier. In fact, starting early enough that it's not even really sex education, it's just agency education, like teaching kids how to use safe words not in the context of sex, how to understand themselves as having bodily desires and agency, how to understand other people as also having bodily boundaries and agency, like really early training up at the educational level in agency, I think could go a long way, not to making things perfect, but to helping. We have work to do in terms of our medical system and our legal system. And the goal of the book is not to be utopian and say, here's how to like have perfectly agential sex, but rather like, what are the real social and interpersonal interventions that we can make in this imperfect world to sustain one another's agency?
So I feel like at this point I need to play the philosopher and ask you, can you explain to us why you talk about sexual agency rather than sexual autonomy?
Yeah,
Well, you talk about autonomy as
I
well,
do.
but I mean, I like,
Yeah.
yeah. As you
This
know,
is,
I'm very interested in this, but it's a bit of a basic question, but I think it's a crucial
I
one for
don't
the
think
book.
it's basic. I think it's really important. And like, this is the way you asked me earlier if it's a philosophy book. And I think this is the way it's most obviously a philosophy book is I have important distinctions in there between autonomy, agency, consent, and consensuality, all of which are like different notions for me, right? And most non-philosophers are not going to do that. Um, it was valuable to me in the book to try to hold on as much as I could, especially because it's a book for a general audience, to everyday senses of terms, even when I knew that there are philosophical debates out there in the background that sometimes give them much more sophisticated meanings. So when I talk about autonomy, I just literally mean the capacity and well, I'll stick to capacity, the capacity to make your own decisions unmanipulated by others, right? So autonomy for me is just this very straightforward thing. Like, can you pick what to do? Do you have the ability to pick what to do? And are people going to let you pick what to do, right? That's autonomy. Agency for me is this much subtler notion. Agency is about whether when you're acting, you are really in the driver's seat of your own narrative. Is what you're doing self expressive and self determining and coming out of who you are? And that might not even involve autonomy because it might not involve any particular decisions. So I think I give this example in the book, but I'm not entirely sure that I do. But like if I'm just like dancing to music I love without even really thinking about it. And my whole body is just filled with this, like, this is my kind of music. And I'm just like letting my body respond to that kind of music. I might not even be making an autonomous decision to dance. And I'm certainly not making an autonomous choice over each move that I do. A lot of it is automated, but to me, that's like really agential. Like I'm expressing myself, my tastes, my ability to use my body how I want to use it in the circumstances that I'm in. So, agency to me is a much richer notion that we can aim for even when we don't necessarily either need or have decisional autonomy. And that's all for me importantly different from consensuality, which is about whether when I'm doing something jointly with somebody else, I and that other person are communicating to each other and recognizing with each other that each of us is doing this with agency and of our own free will, and that we understand that we would not be doing it if both people weren't communicating to each other that we want to be doing it. So consensuality is a different notion, again, that to me requires more than one person. Consensuality is about how our joint interaction works, and it's an inherently communicative notion. Whereas I can be acting with agency all by myself and not communicating at all. And both of those are different from autonomy, which for me is simply the ability to choose freely in the kind of classic liberal sense.
Okay, so maybe that's one of the points where I not disagree with you, but um yeah, have reservations, is that it seems that risk is a crucial aspect of your view about agency.
Yeah,
That you say that so you take this example of this German festival that says push your looks, not your limits.
right.
And you're like, well, we don't want to live in a world like this. We want to live in a world where people take risks, and this is crucial for agency. And I feel like um, this is very close to a discussion that people are having right now about is it a bad thing that young people have less sex than before? And some people, like I sometimes do, say, well, at the end of the day, it's probably better that they have less sex if that means also less bad sex than having sex and taking risks. And I don't know about this. I'm a bit skeptical. Sometimes I meet students who explain to me in discussions that they've just given up on sex because they're too worried that it wouldn't be consensual enough and so on and so forth. And that seems a bit um too bad. But yeah, like what exactly is the meaning of risk in agency? And maybe, like, because I see that the time is going fast, could you say something about how this is linked to your interest for consensual non-consent?
Okay, I'll try to do that last bit.
Yeah.
um, yeah. So I, to me, the point about risk, which is also at least as much a point about being willing to do things about which we feel ambivalent, is really important and not specific to sex. So I don't know what to say about the whole young people having less sex thing, because it feels simplistic to be like, oh no, you should always have more sex, not less. Like that just, yeah, that feels like a simplistic line. And if less sex is what people want, then far be it from me, of all people, to be like, no, you must have it. Um, but more generally, I think there's this idea out there, very prevalent in the sort of discussions around consent, that not only does consent have to be enthusiastic to be real, but you hear slogans like maybe means no, or I'm not sure means no. And if we, putting sex aside, if we lived our lives like that in general, our lives would be so small, right? Like, for example, surely almost nobody would have a child. when you, when you, when you,
Yeah.
when you have a child, you just like, first of all, there's huge risk, right? There's huge risk to you. There's huge risk to the child. Second of all, you really don't know what you're signing up for. You don't know who that child is going to be for your first one. You don't know how it's going to transform your life. But we do it anyway, not because we are enthusiastic and absolutely certain that this is what we want to do and we understand exactly what's going to happen and we've made sure there's no risk, but because sometimes taking that plunge into risk and into ambivalence is not only incredibly rewarding, but it's how we feel the most agential. I think Marianne wants us to stop, but I'm going to finish my point. Is how we feel like the most agential, right? Like there's so many things we do like that, traveling to a risky destination that we really want to see. So I don't want to say that people have to take sexual risks, because for some people, sexual risks are not where they want to push their limits. And that's fine. It's not a universal prescription. But I want to push back more generally on this idea that somehow it's always better to use the precautionary principle and be certain in advance of what we want. I want to say that a life that involves like pushing limits and taking risks and, like, as I put it in the book, flexing our agency, is a life that is going to be fuller and more agential. But you can only do that. That's only a safe thing to do if we also have the good scaffolding. You can't just take risky leaps into nowhere, right? So it's important that if we want people to be able to do things that are risky or that they're ambivalent about, that we have in place things like good exit conditions, freedom from shame if they change their mind, setting up the circumstance so that they feel safe picking either yes or no, or yes and then no, right? Like, we have to make the conditions under which those kinds of risky choices can be made as scaffolded and as safe as possible. But then within that, I do want people to be able to embrace risk. Yeah. I didn't get to consensual non-consenting.
Yeah, but I think we'll have other occasions and maybe in
Yeah.
the Q&A. So I want to ask you a few, like the questions that came up in the Q&A. So the first one is worded very philosophically. It says, are there ethical universals which transcends the contingency of particular cultural scaffolds and which allow for transcultural hermeneutic agreement on good versus bad sex?
I don't know that there's transcultural agreement, because there are some cultures that have unbelievably toxic norms around sex that legitimize certain kinds of rape and so on. But I'm also not particularly a cultural relativist. So I think the question that I'd rather answer, which is closely related, is not, is there anything we agree on, but is there anything we should agree on, right? Is there anything that's general enough that it should apply to all cultures? And there, I think the answer is yes. So, like, I take seriously my Finnish interlocutor's point that, like, how much we talk about sex, that's going to be really culturally variable. Um, I take seriously that, for example, ethical hookup culture of the sort that involves very minimal communication and minimal transaction is going to be ethically possible in some social contexts and not in others, in some cultures and not in others. But yeah, here are some ethical universals. Never do anything to anybody sexually who hasn't made clear that they want it done to them, right? Like that kind of minimal consent bar, that to me is an ethical universal. Um,
Yeah, but
don't
then your ethical universal is saying that the huge majority of the sex that people have is not ethically acceptable.
I don't think that's true, because I think people make clear that they're into sex in all sorts of ways other than like formal consent exchanges. I think plenty of like good, wanted, it's obvious to everybody that everybody's enjoying it. Sex happens all the time. Also, a lot of bad sex happens. You know, I'm not, my head isn't in the sand. There's also a lot of terrible sex. But I think there's plenty of sex that doesn't start with a formal moment of consent, where both people are making very clear to each other that they're into what's
That they
happening.
want it. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's one ethical universal. Another ethical universal to me is don't degrade anybody or shame anybody during or after sex unless you explicitly negotiated as part of a kink scene that that's a thing that you're both into, which is pretty rare, right? But degradation and shame, even if the sex was fully consensual, degrading and shaming somebody in the context of sex, always wrong. And then again, that's going to, like, what that looks like is going to be culturally specific. But I feel like that is an ethical universal that, unless there has been very explicit consent that this is something wanted, shame and degradation are bad things to do to other people in the context of a vulnerable joint activity. So yes, I do think, and I could come up with others. I do think there are ethical universals, but they're going to need to be filled in with cultural details.
Okay, second question from Gorata. So, in some of the sex debates on sex and ethics, some scholars see non consensual sex as a misnomer, viewing sex and sexual violence as opposites and consent being the distinguished factor, whereas some view things in a spectrum and allowing more ambiguity. How do you approach these debates? Yeah.
Let me think and make sure I understand the
I think the
question.
question is, what do you think of the debate of sex and rape are two different things,
Right.
and consent is the differentiation between sex and rape? So there's no such thing as non-consensual sex because then it becomes rape, which is
Right.
like,
Yeah.
it's the whole like gardening and like, is sex violence, is rape violence, or is it sex?
Yeah, yeah. No, I understand the question now. I was just trying to yes, never mind. I understand the question. Um I don't know if I can argue for my answer as well as I would like to. To me, it feels obvious that violent, horrible sex, including rape, is still sex. I don't know. I don't want to reserve the term sex for something good. Um, and I think that it complicates it makes it harder for us to talk about the wrong of rape if rape is not sex, it's just violence, because then we don't have tools for explaining why it's different from other kinds of violence. And we feel that it is.
Yeah, but for instance, Jessie Monton, for instance, had this piece where she argued that maybe it's adopting the perspective of the perpetrator to see rape as sex, because it doesn't feel like sex to the person that it's done to.
Right.
Or,
Although
yeah.
it definitely doesn't just feel like violence most of the time either, right? They're not just like, oh, somebody injured me. The fact that what happened was sexual is usually, though not always, because I want to make room for the whole space of responses to this, is usually super central to the kind of harm that they feel has been done to them. So it may be that they didn't feel it as sexually pleasurable at all, or even as sex from their point of view. But the fact that something sexual happened feels to me essential to talking well about what went wrong and what happened. But I think that the reason people want this view that, non-consensual sex or rape is not sex at all is partly because we have a really strong impulse to want to protect the idea of sex as something really kind of special and discontinuous with the rest of human experience and behavior. And I always have a tendency to push back against that, right? Like, I think sex is special in the sense that it's just like so laden with cultural meanings that, it's always just like bursting with meaning, and that makes it easy for it to be harmful and so on. But basically, sex is just like a thing we do with each other and with our bodies, and I worry about any account that cuts it off too much from other things. So, saying that like bad, violent, non-consensual sex is a whole ontologically different kind of thing than good sex creates this divide in the world, which I think puts sex on a bit of a pedestal, and also I think denies us a lot of just conceptual tools for actually talking about what happened. And I also want to say, I don't think of just consent as straightforwardly the cut either. I think that there's all kinds of like violent, ethically unacceptable, invasive sex where there was consent, and vice versa. Like we said before, I think there's perfectly good sex that has no official initiating moment of consent. So, in addition, I think consent wouldn't be the cut for me if I were going to put the cut there. But it would be more in terms of whether it's like an upholding or a degradation of the person's agency.
Okay, so one last question, I think. Let's see. So from Sunita Sarkar, Dr. Kukla, in passing, I want to express my appreciation of your emphasis on agency as subject to material conditions. My question is about the utopian, in square quotes, aspect of your book. Would you say that your book is not presenting perfect sex, but gesturing at the possibility that better and different is possible if and when certain conditions prevail or are accessible?
Yeah, you captured the spirit of it very well, Sita. Thank you. I think some people are reading it as utopian, which is funny because it mattered so much to me as I was writing to be writing a book about sex between imperfect people in an imperfect world. Like, that was what I wanted to write about. And at one point, actually, my subtitle was going to be something like Sex for an Imperfect World. But I decided that I really wanted to emphasize the positive rather than the negative. So I think you said it exactly right. This book is about, like, given the world's imperfections and our imperfections, what can we actually do socially, interpersonally, and individually to work towards better, different, more pleasurable, more agential, rather than here are the high level principles for perfectly agential, ethically sound, good sex, which I don't really offer. But I do think that the book still reads as a little bit utopian. And I think that that's because we're just not used to talking about good sex. Like, we spend so much time talking about bad sex. And so many feminist books on sex start with including books I love, like Amish Srinivasan's book does this, Kate Mann's book does this, starts with just like a litany of male sexual violence against women, murders, rapes, and so on. And that's the frame against which it happens.
But it is.
Yes, it is, but it's just not the only thing there is to talk about.
Yeah,
I
no,
absolutely
but yeah.
don't deny that it is. You're totally right. It's just not the only topic. And we're so used to that topic that when we start talking about the good sex, I think it feels utopian. Yeah, I absolutely don't deny that stuff happens, that it's important. It just isn't.
No, but but it is. What I mean is that I think for a lot of people, good sex is utopian in the sense that the horizon is how to already just not have terrible sex.
Yeah.
But I agree with you. I
low
mean,
bar.
That's such a low bar. Yeah.
Yeah.
So very briefly, because I think this is interesting. So there are two remaining questions. One is, in the legal context, do you think there's any other concept than consent to determine if it's sexual violence? And the other one that I found also interesting is saying we both agreed that there is a very cringe way philosophers can talk about sex. And so the person is saying, obviously, I'm not asking you to name names, but could you try to find examples of cringe philosophical interventions about sex or bad ways of doing philosophy about sex?
Okay, yeah, and I'll try to go really fast. Oh no, the first one disappeared off the screen, and I wanted to look at it again.
Yeah, it was about consent as a legal.
Right, the legal question. Yeah. Yeah, I'm so bad at this question. I'm not a legal philosopher, and I really struggle to know how to codify any of this into a legal context. I think maybe a sort of a more thoughtful, better notion of consent is the best we can do in a legal context when it comes to like convicting people of rape and assault. But what I actually most care about when it comes to the legal context is that we work on building a culture of restorative justice and supporting victims rather than a culture focused entirely on finding measures for who we're going to be punitive and carceral towards. And I don't have any better answers to the finding measures for punitive and carceral than the consent answer right now, which I'm not sure if it's a good answer or not, but I don't have a better one. But I just feel like our legal system is so focused on carcerality and punishment and is so horrible for victims. And I wish that the focus were different. So that's the first one. As for the second one.
1 minute for the second one. Yeah.
Good, because I absolutely refuse to give examples of cringe philosophy examples because everybody would know who I was talking about. But what I will say is that I think it's just, in general, it's cringe when philosophers feel like they need to talk about sex by giving examples that have absolutely nothing to do with sex and don't even actually involve other people because they feel too awkward to talk about sex itself. And so just generally that sort of tradition of like taking it out of the sexual domain and talking about like weird stuff to do with like cell phone contracts and so on, that's where it starts feeling cringy to me.
To us, yeah. I think we agree on this and we even talk about it. Well, thank you, Quill. That was fast. That was exciting. Well, at least for me. I hope it
really
was for everyone else. Yeah, well, I think you should all read Quill's book. So Sex Beyond Yes, Pleasure and Agency for Everyone, and gift it to your friends and family that feel super uncomfortable talking about sex, because I think Quill is very good at showing that we can talk about sex in a non-cringe way, and that it's really worth it. So, yeah.
And thank you, Manon. That was a great discussion. And thanks, Miriam, for hosting.